The wheel of time turns and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again.
Welcome to Through the Glass Columns, a Wheel of Time read-along podcast. Each week, we will be reading, discussing, and digesting a small selection from Robert Jordan's fantasy opus. This quest is led by Tylor, a true Wheel of Time warrior.
I have all stories, ages that were and that will be. And I'll be joined by Greg, a complete novice to the Wheel of Time.
The Wheel of Time and the wheel of a man's life turn alike without pity or mercy.
Join us each week as we read the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time, traveling deeper and deeper through the glass columns.
But what does that even mean?
No. You don't get to find out yet.
Hello and welcome back to Through the Glass Columns, your weekly Wheel of Time read-along podcast. Gosh, it's so exciting here. I really should have said your weekly read-along podcast for Eye of the World, because I only have a couple more chances to say it that way. I am one of your hosts, Greg, who, if you can't tell, is very thrilled to be closing in on the end of this book and eager to finish it up. And I am joined, of course, as always, by our local expert, Tylor. Tylor, how's it going?
It is going very good. I have thus far tried to kind of rein in how much I talk about whether I like or dislike this book, but let me tell you, I am very ready to have this one done. So closing in on the end is definitely a very good thing. And it's worth noting we have some timey-wimey things going on here. We are recording what is next week, or this past week's episode, a day and a half after the last time that we recorded, and then the next two episodes we talked about are going to be bundled together when we release them. So just be aware, when we say next week, I have no idea what that means anymore. But that is definitely going to be a phrase that we need to reevaluate. That being said, I think we dive straight into an ill-advised discussion of visual media on a completely non-visual podcast, unless you have something else to bring in.
No, you promised us a week/2 days ago that we would be talking about the chapter image at the start of actually both of these chapters of 48 and 49, which you dubbed Creepy Tree. So, again, listener, jump over to our Twitter page or to our Instagram account, and I've hopefully posted that. I really need to give credit. There's one website that just has all of them that I keep just blatantly ripping off because they're all just there.
That's where my tattoo came from.
Yeah, there you go. So I guess all Wheel of Time fans use that site. So you call this Creepy Tree, and it is kind of a nice juxtaposition of the one we had the week before, certainly. So I know, again, last week/2 days ago, we talked about the layering effect that was present, that we had kind of dark, white, light, dark, light, dark, light. And I would say that's present here again. And, you know, as much as I had like unique, interesting messages there for it, those would seemingly all apply here. The main difference here is that instead of the dark being purely on top of the light, in terms of the tree on top of the moon, this tree is much more enclosing the light, which it's warped and bent, as listener, you see now in that image. And I think that lets probably more of a percentage of the light shine through, and yet it feels more sinister because it is capturing it, and you almost see motion in this image as it might enfold upon the light and clasp it in its tree grip. I don't know what I'm talking about at this point.
Well, and I think what's really interesting to me about this image in comparison to the previous one is that the previous image, I think, very clearly reads as like moon on, a quiet night. Whereas this one, I think it seems like both the tree and the light behind it are significantly larger, and that could just be a perspective issue, but it also could very easily be read as the sun as opposed to the moon. And I think that kind of feeds into what you're saying with stronger light, but also stronger dark in this image. And that, I think, very much fits the way that this chapter icon is used, because I think it is largely used in the same way that Sleepy Time Tree tree is used. It's nature sequences. It's sequences that, you know, have some exposition or development of something new for the world. But rather than being in the natural world, as Sleepy Time Tree is, Creepy Tree specifically refers to the nature of the Blight. And so this kind of highlights just the fact that this is similar to the traditional natural icon, but as you say, is kind of twisted and warped in a way that I think is a really good representation of how we see the Blight represented in these two chapters.
Yeah, and now that we've said all the smart things, let me also just say the seasonal dorky thing of it also very much looks like Charlie Brown's Christmas tree,
Yes,
right? Especially when the tree gets Linus's blanket wrapped around it and then has the single ball bending it down. There's a leaf that looks like the ball and just some naughtiness to the trunk. That's naughtiness with a K, not naughtiness with the N-A-U-G-H-T. One other stray, I won't promise it's smart observation, is just in terms of the sun or the moon, like you said, and I like the reading that it's perhaps the sun. There is just this nice little peak of it around the backside of the bend of the tree. So you know, in that kind of way I said, it feels like it's enclosing it. There is just this little bit escaping that, right? Like there's not just the way out, but there's this little bit it couldn't capture. And, you know, just thematically, that seems to resonate to me with what we've been talking about, that, you know, it's Princess Leia. The more you close your grip, the more star systems will slip through your fingers. And I think there's a sense of that in this book as well. Like the stronger the powerful dart gets, they just miss more and more, and things happen as time goes on.
Yeah, and I think there are two other little details in this image that I want to highlight. The first is that in the original Sleepy Time Tree image, we kind of saw the light as being highlighting, or almost, you know, the moonlight shining off the edges of the tree. Here, I like that the branches of the tree are extremely light with only really faint, dark outlines, just because I think it's really striking against the, you know, light background. But also in this chapter, or chapter 48, I guess I should specify it's on both chapters, we learn about the stick, this evil creature that looks like a stick and will digest you after it has bitten you. And I actually took a moment to just like look over this image. I'm like, okay, let me just make sure that none of these like has legs and I didn't notice it the first time. And I think that's just a nice little nod to kind of the reaching trees and the stick and just how horrible plant life seems to be in the Blight. The other thing that I really like about this image is if you look at the section of the sun or moon that is unobscured, it is very, very close to the shape of the dragon's fang or the tear that we had identified in previous chapter icons. And I think that's just a very nice visual nod that was worked into this. Any last thoughts about Creepy Tree before we move on to the Blight?
Only that, like, to agree with what you just said, that it's shaped like the dragon's fang, or the kind of not a yin yang side, that outer edge of the tree kind of reinforces that. There's just one segment of the tree that if you read it slightly differently, it looks like this is actually a tree standing in front of the not a yin yang yin yang. So yeah, that's present there, although I guess the little shred of light on the outside of the tree works against that interpretation of it. But all right. You know, our dear listener, I know we have many dear listeners, but the one who reaches out the most is our good friend Ben. And he always says that when he hears us talking about one of those images, he then assumes it's going to be like a great work of art. And then he looks and it's like, oh, it's just like a little tiny icon. So I think we have done that little tiny icon justice if you want to dive into our first summary for today.
Yeah, and as we're talking about little tiny icons, it is worth noting we are getting to the section at the end of the book where we are also reading little tiny chapters. And so I probably expect that these recaps and episodes in general are going to get a little bit shorter until the very, very end, right? Obviously, climaxes take a little more time That's not this week.
Oh, I thought you were going for that's what she said again. Okay. Anyway.
So in the Blight, we begin with the group being escorted by Ingtar and 100 soldiers to the edge of the Blight, and Rand observes the way that the border of the Blight has been defended previously, with a number of towers with strong walls that have signals that would normally signal to have the the cavalry come and clean out whatever Trollocs are attacking. But he notices, even someone who isn't trained in the military, just how sparsely guarded those towers are now, because it seems that every soldier has made their way north to the Blight. It also becomes apparent that Ingtar is quite upset at having been given the duty of guiding them towards the Blight, because he wants to be at Tarwin's Gap fighting in the Great Battle. Eventually, they are rid of him. They make their way north into the Blight. And initially, the description of the Blight is just, it's awful. It's hot and it's muggy and it smells and everything is terrible, and the plants want to kill you and the insects want to kill you, and it's bad. Eventually, they make their way to a place where they are going to camp. It actually is in the ruins of Malkir. They can see the 7 ruined towers, and they can also see the lakes that Malkir is famous for. I think we've gotten one reference to it. Although it turns out you don't want to go to the lakes now. There are octopuses with hands in there, and that is a horrible image. Once they have made camp, Moraine kind of disguises the camp using some of her magic. She almost like bends the air so it can't be seen from a distance. And Egwene gets very excited about this, saying that Moraine says she can now channel enough of the power to be able to do something similar. And then Nynaeve says that she is also going to study at the White Tower, and Egwene basically says, and Rand, you can come too. You could be my warder. And I think that that's an interesting moment for kind of setting the stakes for what the characters hope they're going to be doing in the future. But it's also worth noting because Moraine agrees and says that there is definitely something for Rand to do in Tar Valon, which I think is an interesting reaction. The last thing that we see in this chapter is, yeah,
it's heartbreaking. Yeah,
it
sorry.
really is.
I didn't mean to mess up your flow.
No, it's the correct noise to be making at this moment in the recap. Yeah, so Rand is unable to sleep, and he witnesses just a truly heartbreaking moment between Nynaeve and Lan, where it becomes apparent that they have some feelings for each other that have been developing, and Lan, as the heir to a ruined kingdom and the battle to avenge it, doesn't want to kind of give that to Nynaeve as, his gift to his bride. And then there's just this absolutely lovely scene of him saying, like, I'm gonna love whoever you marry, and it's wonderful. And then she cries, and then I end my recap and am sad. So rescue us from the depression of the end of this chapter. What jumped out at you when you were reading this, other than obviously the last page and a half, which is just wonderfully written and terrible for what Robert Jordan has done to us?
Yeah, so I have actually, I'm not going to say these are criticisms really, because they're not that strong, but I will say it struck me at the beginning of the chapter that we were kind of breaking out of the first person narrator quite a bit. There was some details you shared there about like knowing the way the towers work, but there were these very explicit details of like there was a stream of soldiers in this direction and a smaller stream and this, and it's like, yeah, Rand could know those things, but it was very clear that Robert Jordan was like, I want to set you a big scene. And it's a great scene, right? This imagery of the huge trail, kind of armored soldiers, and then the women and children fleeing, and this tiny trickle of men willing to stay. And I was like, you're kind of cheating just a little bit, but it was justified, I think, in those moments. So I would just say kind of then as a general opener, that I was really surprised at what the Blight was like. I think because we've been so far north in this continent, and then we continued north, and again, like I said last week, Game of Thrones was on my mind with the wall and all that. I was expecting ice and freezing and wind and cold. And so the fact that it was getting hotter was really disconcerting
Yeah.
because it was so unexpected. And yet, I mean, I hate both the hot and the cold. That's why I stay indoors. But at the same time, I feel like it felt so much more visceral as kind of a sickness, because hot, humid, sickly swamp is kind of disgusting.
Yeah, and I really like the idea of the blight as being as unnatural as possible, right? And in any
Mm,
way that Robert Jordan can make it feel like something is not occurring the way it should, that's how the blight works, right? It's the twisted opposite evil dimension that no one really wants to go to. And I actually think it's very interesting how it's described in the book, because actually television show readers will recognize this is not what the blight looks like
mm,
in the television show. And I think the trouble is that so much of what is disconcerting in the book is the smell and the temperature and the feel and things that don't
mm,
necessarily translate as well in a visual medium. But I think the show did a good job of identifying exactly what you pointed out. The thing that feels wrong about this is that it has a rhyme or reason to it, and it's the opposite of how nature works. And I
mm.
think they found an interesting way to do that kind of same thing of making something that looks both natural and unnatural simultaneously. So I'm curious to see your reaction to that, given your strong
Mm.
reaction to kind of the way that the blight is portrayed here. While we're still in the early part of the chapter, I'm also curious your thoughts. We had just like this brief sojourn with the character of Ingtar, this soldier who was so gung ho to go to Tarwin's Gap and then had to stay behind to escort them to the blight. I'm curious whether you had any thoughts on that kind of brief insight to a character. You know Robert Jordan well enough now that if someone has that big of a spotlight on them, they're going to show up at some point again. What were your
Yeah.
thoughts on that quick character portrait?
I think it was striking how everybody else reacted to him. He says something along the lines of the peace favor your blade,
Yeah, peace
something
favor
like
your
that.
sword. Yeah,
Favor your sword. And everybody's like, whoa, what a weirdo. Like he said something deeply perverted, which I think he did, right? Like
yeah,
deeply perverted to their values. And so it didn't make sense to them. And so that was what struck me the most. He seemed to be the kind of archetype of the eager soldier who wants to go to war. And normally I would finish that statement with, but has never actually known war. However, in this case, it's clear that he's from a society that has known war and battle and so on. So I don't think he's naive. So it's something different. And I read it just as honor, right?
yeah.
You know, um, I mentioned before I do a lot. I did a lot of studies on classical epics of like the Iliad in particular, or the Aeneid in this case too, and that's all that it was about, right? Like, let me
Yeah.
die with honor, let me get honor to my name, and it felt like one of those. And in some ways, that is a very clever thing for Robert Jordan to do. And actually, George R. R. Martin does this a lot too, where you show a type from an old type of myth and have them kind of leave the story. And that just immediately demonstrates I'm telling a different kind of story. Like what you know doesn't matter. Right. So I thought that was very clever in that way. And he was interesting, particularly in the response he drew from the others.
Yeah, and I think for me, the contrast that was most interesting is the contrast with Lan, right? Because they
Mm,
are both from, northern cultures. Malkir literally borders Shinar, and so they likely have some cultural similarity in how they think about war and the blight. And so it was really interesting to that moment you say where, Ingtar is, talking about wanting to get to Tarwin's Gap and needing to get there so he can battle for honor, and he's so eager for it. And then to contrast that with Lan, who's almost philosophical about the phrase, peace favor your sword, right? He says, well, what's going on there is when you've never known peace, you use it as a talisman, even in times of
mm,
war. And, to get that very divergent reaction of two characters who clearly kind of think of honor the same way, but don't think of violence or how you earn honor the same way, I think is a really useful contrast. And as you're saying, it's Robert Jordan signaling you're kind of used to the trope of the king of a fallen kingdom. This dude's not Aragorn, right? I feel like
yeah.
Ingtar reads a little bit more in that like Aragorn, Boromir kind of line. Robert Jordan is, as you're saying, kind of signposting, no, 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 Lan is not that. Here's how he's different. And I think that's a useful thing for us to have at the very end of a book where he's been a mystery the whole time.
Oh, I just thought of a question that I want to ask you in like 2 episodes. Trying to bookmark it in my mind as a part of that. Um, yes, and I think as the characters move into the Blight and everything becomes stranger and weirder, that's where like I was looking for Lan to kind of become the leader of the pack, and that's not.
Yeah.
He continues to play the same role, right? He doesn't evolve in any way in light of all that we've learned about him, right? That's how I should phrase it. Is I was really expecting him to be different now that we'd learned so much more about him, and it's like, oh no, he's still the same character,
Yeah.
which is the smart choice and Robert Jordan writing it well. It's just funny how different that feels with my expectations changed.
Yeah, and I think this is something that Robert Jordan is really good at is a lot of books I feel like the authors find the revelation at some point down the line and then they kind of write the characters to fit the revelation after some point. Robert Jordan, I think, at least for Lan and Moraine, came into this knowing every single detail about their backstory, right? I think he did the George R.R. Tolkien. He could have written an entire book about the backstory to the book kind of thing. And he did, right? It's the prequel novel. But I think that works really effectively in moments like this, where the revelation doesn't change how the character acts. It changed how you read everything they've done before, and it makes how they act make more sense. And it's a tricky puzzle to assemble correctly, but when things lock into place well, like they do with Lan here, I think you get the feel of reading the character different without the character actually being different.
Yeah, and that is a real trick, and it's just making me envious of you on your multiple read throughs, right? Because that's the other thing it does is it rewards multiple read throughs. Again, we try to make these timeless, but there's maybe where I got COVID is I went out and saw the new Ryan Johnson Glass Onion movie, and that kind of whodunit works exactly the same way, right? Where it's like, oh, you get the twist, and then a really good one means you watch it a second time and you see that it was exactly all the clues were there. You just weren't smart enough to figure it out the first time around. So, I guess I'm just making an aside there, but it is a part of kind of the joy of reading a good tale like that if it's masterfully constructed.
Yeah, absolutely. And what jumps to my mind for that is Agatha Christie, right? The Poirot novels are some of my, or not novels, they're all short stories, but they're some of my favorite things to read, or I love them as audiobooks. There was a summer where I drove the Google Street View car and the radio doesn't work in the Google Street View car. So I listened to every Agatha Christie mystery that my local library had.
That's awesome.
I think that's why I love these books so much, is they build those kind of mysteries around characters and moments. And it works really effectively here. In setting up those mysteries, I think part of what Robert Jordan does so well, though, is he establishes kind of expectations that we have for characters that he can then effectively defy. And I think Egwene and Nynaeve and a few other characters kind of set some expectations in this chapter. I'm curious what you thought and how much you kind of either believe Robert Jordan is going this direction or don't, with the different kind of plans that all of the characters make during this chapter.
Oh, they all just have 2 more weeks until their pension kicks in, and then they're going to retire happy. It was very much in that mode. And what I thought was well done about it is it could be really cheesy, right? Like, we're going to all be happy together. And you're like, no, you're not. But the characters reacting to what they said also understood that, right? Yeah. So one of the notes I made is that they all clearly sense that whatever is going to happen at the Eye of the World is going to change everything. So they are kind of going through the motions of making these plans just to kind of pretend to have the fantasy that that is actually a life that could happen, a life that could be. And it's clear they all know it's not going to happen. And yet, in your summary, you mentioned Moraine is there like, haha, I actually do know, and gives these like tantalizing little clues about like, yeah, there's more to come. There's more something to happen. So all of that worked really effectively to me. And kind of related to that, but also just the blight in general. One other note I had is if we're looking at people who owe Robert Jordan's estate money, this chapter made Jeff Vandermeer jump on that list to
Oh,
me, who
yep.
did the Area X trilogy, better known as Annihilation and the two other A words. I don't
Yeah.
acceptance might be the third one. I
I only
forget
read
the
the
middle one.
first one.
That's the way to do it. But so much of that is based on this same idea because you have a first person narrator. I believe it's in diary entries or something like that, a device like that, um, going into this foreign place. So the place is very reminiscent of the blight, but then so much of that is like all the things that they will do and that they'll get credit for, and the things they're gonna solve, and then the character is realizing more and more, and it gets much more complicated than that, but it's very reminiscent just in these two ways, these two valences to that. Um and and that was really my note on Egwene. Like, it seems clear even in her fantasy that the order is, I'm becoming an Aes Sedai. I hope I get to see everybody else and still have them as a part of my life. And while that second part is a fantasy, nothing's going to change the first part in her mind.
Yeah, and I think earlier when you were talking about Egwene's plan and how everyone reacts to it, you said everyone kind of knows that this is not actually how things are going to go. But I think one of the most interesting moments to me is the fact that most of the kids, like lowercase k, know that this isn't going to happen. Rand capital K knows Min told him so, right? And I
Right.
love that moment where he is reacting. He agrees to be Egwene's warder and immediately thinks of the sentence that Min told him, you're not for her and she's not for you, not the way you want. And I thought that was just really effectively done. And unless we have anything else to talk about with the teenagers, I think it's time to talk about the emotional moment in this chapter that was really effectively done. And speaking of me kind of doing mild spoilers as we read, now you know why every chapter Nynaeve and Lan were together. I was asking you about that relationship. What was your reaction to this revelation at the end of the chapter?
It was interesting to see two characters that have been so devoted to something outside of themselves take just a minute to mourn that they can't be there for themselves, right?
Yeah.
I think similar to the Egwene stuff, they knew this was never going to actually happen or be a part of it. But it's interesting to me that I shouldn't use the collective pronoun. I didn't see the romance there, and I think in that way it made me feel very much like one of these kids, because that's what teenagers do, right? They just are thinking so much about themselves, they don't realize what's going on in the people around them. And my single parent can have a love life that doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of that resonated with me. Maybe I'm just, again, working through being a kid of divorce live on air, but I do think that was effectively drawn. And then what's so heartbreaking about it is like Egwene, there's just no question, right? It's not, I want to run away, let's do it, let's give in. It's, no, we're just set on different paths, and whatever this connection we feel is doesn't matter. And that's sometimes the most heartbreaking type of breakup of all.
Yeah, and I think that this scene highlights something that I think Robert Jordan does really effectively, which is a lot of times he shows us the build up to moments in, kind of side pieces of sequences, and our characters aren't paying attention to them, so we don't pay attention to those moments. And I think, as you were saying before, you felt like when you were reading this, like you were, a teenager who isn't paying, enough attention to the people around them, and so you're surprised when moments like this happen. I think that's intentional by Robert Jordan to some degree, and this is one of the controversial things I think about this book. Is some people read this as the book is withholding a lot of information. I wish I was just getting it and kind of knew where the story stood. And then I'm, like we were talking about earlier, I see this as an elaborate puzzle that is very fun to pick apart. But I think for people who want clear information now, this style of, I'm only going to focus on what Rand is focusing on, and sometimes the breadcrumbs are going to look just like breadcrumbs until you realize they form a path, is an interesting approach by Robert Jordan. I'm curious whether you think it works for you, or whether you find you're too often finding revelations that you weren't expecting when they show up. Does that make sense?
It does, and I'm going to go a weird place in my answer, which is I was just listening to a podcast that was, doing the old time-worn tradition on the internet of making fun of Lost, and their complaint about Lost in this particular case was that like it all could have been solved if the two characters had just talked to each other, but they kept secrets and they blah blah blah. And so it's very much that same idea. And I realized listening to that, I mean, it didn't bother me at the time on Lost, and it doesn't bother me in this book if it's always natural to the characters, right? That, yes, you're withholding information from me, but all you're really doing is keeping me in the head of whatever character I'm in the head of. And so, and I'm just basically repeating and rephrasing what you just said, but it is effective to me that it's like, okay, well, if Rand doesn't know, then I don't get to know. Or, if the teenagers don't sense the love plot happening just off screen, then we don't get to sense it. And I don't find that frustrating at all, especially because it's just I trust the storyteller to unfurl what I need when I need it. And we just talked through this big kind of clink together of the puzzle, and it's like, yeah, if you're gonna give me revelations like that, then I don't need to like be angry at you that you're saving some details back in order to construct the puzzle.
Yeah, and I will say, I, as a reader of Jordan, 100% agree with you. Me, as someone who is podcasting with a co-host who doesn't know what the puzzles are, this is impossible. I hate it so much because I have to try to highlight the pieces of puzzles that you don't know are puzzles. So that has been my challenge for the past 6 months. I just need you all to be aware. Was there anything else you wanted to say about the Nynaeve Lan revelation or relationship before we move on to the next chapter?
Just to hone in on the beauty of the last line of he pretended to be asleep so she wouldn't know he saw her crying. Just heartbreaking. And, what a lonely moment. All these characters are alone together in the middle of this blight. It's they're all their own little bent light campsites in the larger disease ruined world. So very effective, very heartbreaking.
Yeah, and I think that continues in the beginning of the next chapter, right? Because Rand wakes up not realizing that he had fallen asleep. I feel like that is something we can all relate to. And then he realizes that Nynaeve has not slept. And I actually thought that we were talking just a moment ago about kind of what information we're allowed and what information we're not allowed. And a really beautiful example of that happens next in this chapter, where Egwene comforts Nynaeve and they have a brief conversation that Rand doesn't hear any of, but he clearly is paying close attention to, and he witnesses it. And I think it's really well drawn what information we know and what we're left to infer. It's just a really effectively done scene. They then break camp and they make their way into the Blight proper. This is where we learn about sticks, which will dissolve you unless you cut off whatever part of the body they have bitten. This is where we learn that trees will reach out and try to eat you, and then the trees reach out and try to eat them. And various other creatures that seem very creepy are also attacking them. All of the characters get to use their signature weapon. The only note that I had is that Matt isn't using the dagger, he's using his bow. But this is kind of an opportunity for all of the characters to show off how much they've grown in terms of combat. And then everything that's trying to kill them runs away because of worms. It turns out that worms are much scarier than their name would imply. The characters are running away from the worms. They are progressively getting more and more worried that they won't make it to the mountains. And when it seems that all hope is lost, suddenly they are no longer in the Blight. They are in a place with lush greenery and no signs of corruption. And this is when they meet the Green Man, a large humanoid creature composed seemingly entirely of plants. He does have one odd scar of rot across his body, but otherwise he just seems very nice and friendly. He greets Loyal very warmly. He has a couple of interesting reactions to a couple of other characters that I'm sure we're going to discuss in the chapter. And then he says there is no greater need than getting to the eye of the world. He remembers where they are in the turnings of the wheel, and he agrees to take them to the eye at the end of the chapter. So this is kind of our last taste of the waste, at least so far. I'm curious your reaction to this chapter in general. That I always feel like is the biggest example we've gotten so far in these books of the buildup and then immediate fizzle that we have seen so many times. What was your reaction to this chapter?
Yeah, so again, I was thinking a lot about those Vandermeer books, Annihilation, and how they have these kind of near Earth. I guess it's kind of creatures that have been corrupted, and that's part of the mystery of what's going on. And that's so much of what we're getting here: the stick, the worm, and then the back to the octopus with hands. It's like just a little bit more monstrous versions of Earth things that we would recognize. And so again, that vibe came through. And it was, it very much felt, I couldn't remember. Shoot, it's probably like Doctor Who that was in my mind, like images of characters kind of jumping through a portal at the last second, or like a doorway into the TARDIS or something like that. Stargate, yeah, it's kind of all similar images, right? Of like everything is folding up around characters. Actually, I think Harry Potter has some of that too, and then they blast through or something. And so I think from the minute I started reading this chapter, I felt that, and I'm picturing Creepy Tree now. I felt everything collapsing in on itself, and it really just felt inevitable that this was going to have to lead to just being miraculously saved in some ways. A couple details from that. I also noted that Matt got the kill shot with his bow and arrow, and seemed to impress Lan, which, as we've noted, is no simple feat. But my favorite detail, and I'm sure you were going to mention this one, is that when they let out all their battle cries, they again seem to be possessed by something older. And the exact phrasing they used, which I loved, was that they were lost to the present. And that was really cool to me because, again, we've gotten these hints that it's the Manetheren blood. I believe Rand in this chapter yells out Manetheren, even though he's like, I don't, it doesn't fit. But it just seemed to me that really expresses that idea that it's not that they are not in control of their actions. It's that they are almost in like a deeper kind of control of their actions, that they are out of the present. So I thought that was really cool.
Yeah, and I think that phrasing is a really interesting link to something that we've brought up over and over again on this show, which is deep time, right? I love the idea of being lost to the present because it means that they're not gone. It means they are some other time. And that is a really interesting way to think about how the past could kind of bubble up. Another moment that I just thought was worth a quick mention is right before the fleeing from the worms. When they are breaking camp, Moraine takes a moment to clear the residues of her magic. She says they would they would clear on their own after a day, but she doesn't want anyone to be able to follow them. And I just think that's an interesting little bit of world building that, is worth noting and something that we should be aware of going forward. People can apparently follow channelers if they're not careful about removing the, residuum or whatever it is from that lingers after they use their magic. Were there any other moments in the Blight section of the chapter that stood out to you or you thought were especially interesting?
Just to underscore what you said, that it's very strange that the worm is overpowering them, and that's what's coming through as the power here. It's like, oh, we're afraid of a worm, and it doesn't denote just a worm, like it is this other kind of monstrous creature, but it was really strange. And then my last note on that section is that Lan really is just like ready to sacrifice himself and like totally gung-ho, like I'll do this and then you guys can get further. And then that's when the kind of blip happens and he doesn't have to, right? He's just like boop.
Exactly. And I think if we're thinking about the way that the Green Man and Moraine have been talking about this, they've been describing how do you get to the Green Man? It is in moments of need. And so I think that just tells us how dire that moment actually was, right? That the moment of is Lan going to go or not is the moment where they truly need to be saved or else they're going to lose their first member. So I think that's really interesting that that's the moment that they hop over. Then we are, as I said earlier, kind of at the point where everything fizzles if you're looking for a big ol' action climax. So what was your reaction to the Green Man showing up?
I called it Deus Ex Green Man, which I was very proud of in my COVID fever dreams the other day. I was like, yes. I actually wasn't disappointed. I think had felt so obvious from the beginning that this was, this was us tumbling down a hill and we had to hit the bottom and get out of this mess very quickly. So it didn't really surprise me. Even as much as the characters, because the characters were clearly like, well, this is supposed to be over the mountain. But I really liked the Green Man's language around, this place is always where it needs to be, and you needed it to be here. That actually it wouldn't be me if I wasn't doing a Lord of the Rings reference. It's Gandalf, right? A wizard arrives exactly when he intends to. He is never early or never late. So I really liked that bit of it, and the arrival. I didn't find it frustrating. I don't think it's your hints that there's not a big action climax coming. I'm not interested in the creature battle. Those things never work as well in books as they would in something. Like, I'm sure the show could make a meal out of them fighting the worm, but it's harder to do in a book.
Yeah, I completely agree. And so I think then the last thing we definitely want to talk about is when the Green Man is speaking to the characters. He drops a few, I think, really intriguing bits, even though we only have about a page of him interacting with the characters. There were 3 that jumped out at me, greetings that he had for a variety of different characters that I wanted to kind of get your thoughts on.
Wait, let me predict them. Let me go.
Do it.
All right. Well, so an aside first, did you picture Jolly Green Giant? Is that what you're picturing for the Green Man? Yeah, go ahead.
I'm more just like Treebeard, but made of produce is kind of where my mind goes.
And again, we're not going to date this to a specific time and place, but did you already watch the Guardians of the Galaxy Christmas special? The new Groot is super creepy.
Swole Groot. I love it.
Yeah, he's clearly a dude in a suit, for people who haven't seen it, with CG enhancements. And I was texting with a friend. I was like, they didn't just make a new Groot for this show. This is going to be the volume 3 Groot. And she was like, no, like, he looked too goofy, like, they're not good. And sure enough, when the trailer dropped, it was like, yep, this is the new Groot. So we're all in for swole Groot for a while to come. So anyway, Green Man, swole Groot, totally works. Like, that's where my head was, like, paint that guy green, and that's where I was for the Green Man. Okay, revelation number 1. You definitely want to talk about how the Green Man knew immediately that Perrin was a wolf brother, and was impressed that the old ways still exist, I believe is what he says.
Yes, exactly. I think he even asks it as a question. He's like, oh, are the old times already back again? And I think that that's a really interesting reaction, especially when at the end of the chapter, we learn he remembers well enough to know where they are in the turnings of the wheel, right? So the idea that he's been around so long that things that are old to the universe are fairly new, or don't feel nearly as old to him, I think is a really interesting detail there. Any thoughts about how he might have known Perrin was a wolf brother, or did his reaction change the way that you've been thinking about wolf brothers at all?
That's clearly something you keep asking me about, so it's more important than I'm giving it credit for. Maybe it's a piece of some kind of puzzle. But I will note, I did have in my notes for the last chapter that they bring it up again. And that was a time when I'm like, okay, buddy, I get it. Like, be suspicious. Yeah. Don't forget he's going wolfy. The reaction was just like, yep, he's wolfy. And again, I'm so clear on, like, the wolf brothers are awesome and you're just gaining superpowers. That's where my head's at on him, that I'm like, yeah, acknowledge it. And we get that there are outward symbols of him already, yellow eyes and so on. So especially when we're meeting the man behind the curtain in the Emerald City, it just makes, hey, Green Man, Emerald City. Then it just makes sense that he senses that.
Absolutely. You said you were going to try to get all of the 3 that I was thinking about. One was absolutely Perrin and the wolf brother. What's the next one you think?
Number 2, Child of the Dragon being the greeting for Rand. This, to me, which may just be my poor memory, is totally new and totally fresh. Okay. So says a few interesting things, calls him Child of the Dragon, notes that his clothing is different and of a different time, but then emphasizes that the sword is not of the time he expected him or the time of the clothing.
Correct.
Aha. I really do feel like an honor student right now. Like, yes, I've got it. I'm impressing the professor. So the heron sword has been remarked upon over and over again, but
Yeah.
to have such a clear calling out of it, and again, the Green Man brings to mind the Green Knight from Arthurian legends, and we know Arthurian legends are very much in play at this one. And where the way he's talking is like the Green Knight in that this has happened over and over again and repeated in deep time, all those things. That means that this is a scratch in the record, right? That
Yeah.
he's not expecting the sword, and the sword is going to be a part of how this is different this time. And you know there's lots of variations on the Green Knight, but essentially there are some versions of the Green Knight that it happens over and over again, but this time we're experiencing is actually the last time. It's the
Right.
breaking of it. And so I feel like that bit of the sword just took my mind immediately there. This is the breaking of the pattern into a fresh direction.
Absolutely. And I think that what's interesting to me is that it's not just that the sword breaks the pattern, it's that the sword, in conjunction with Rand's seemingly ethnicity or background, is what's interesting to the Green Man, right? Because he doesn't say it's a terrible thing that you have a sword or what have you. He says, oh, the sword seems very odd for a child of the dragon, either now or then. And so that's something that we might want to be keeping an eye on, is if what the Green Man is identifying is that Rand is not of Manetheren, right? He's clearly of somewhere else, the children of the dragon, but he has this connection to his father Tam and kind of some other society through the sword. That kind of dual place is something really interesting that the Green Man is noting that we weren't aware of yet. We wouldn't have had any reason to think that him wearing a sword would be odd, given that he is from some other culture. We're getting a hint about what that culture looks like, and I think that's really interesting information, especially given that we're towards the end of this book. We don't expect there to be too many more huge revelations. I think that's something kind of useful for us to piece together when we're thinking about the puzzle of Rand's parentage. Anything else either about Rand and the children of the dragon, or what do you think is the last thing that I wanted to talk about? Oh, I think you are muted still.
I took a drink of water. Thank you. So nothing further to say about that, except that I'm going to go on a limb and predict that's it for this book on Rand. I think that's a mystery that we keep learning about in like 3 or 4 books. And so I think giving us a name for it and things to watch for is kind of the last little gift he's going to give us, is my prediction. And so the third one, I only have one left in my notes. So it has to be Moraine if I'm going to get it right.
That is correct. Yes. We could have potentially also talked about Loyal and him being referenced as Tree Brother, but no, that's not enough to dig our teeth into. Yeah, let's talk about Moraine.
So Moraine has been here before, which
Yep.
we had hints at last week,
Yep.
because they said you can't go back. And that seems to be his attitude initially, is you've been here before and you can't go back. And then he switches on that. Basically, as soon as Moraine's like, nope, here's why, and he's like, oh, you got it, let's go to the eye. Like he realizes where they're at in the story and what needs to happen. So I think the only natural questions to take away from that are, how long ago was she here, and what was she here for before? It is very clear that it's 2 times. So in this pattern we're talking about recursion, it can't be that she's been here many times. And now to reference something that I think a lot of people hate, it is very reminiscent of the Matrix sequels, where you eventually get in the room with the architect, and he expresses that this is now the 7th iteration of Neo, or maybe it's the 6th, that has made it to that point, and then they reset the Matrix and do it over again. That feels like it's very much structured like this moment, but Moraine has been here a second time. Now, was she here before with the last version of Rand, the last chosen one, or was she here on her own business within kind of the normal lifespan of a human? I think that's up in the air from my perspective. I imagine you have concrete answers that you can't share, but is there some pieces from this book I'm not considering?
I don't think that there's any pieces that you're necessarily missing. I think what's interesting for me in this discussion is that your metaphor, I think, really works, right? The architect and the matrix kind of is a good comparison point for this, right? We're now learning a little bit more about the rules of the game instead of just watching the game be played, right?
Yeah.
And what's interesting to me is that what I'm used to in moments like this is meeting characters that are nearly all powerful, right? We're meeting characters that are shaping the world or are dictating how things work. And what's really interesting to me about the Green Man is that he doesn't seem to be that in control, right? As you said, the Green Man seems just as surprised as anyone else that Moraine was able to get there a second time, right? His reaction, you read it as like almost denial. I read it as like, wait, what? How? Huh? And I think there's also another reference here to the fact that he didn't know that the time had come again, right? When he says, oh, it must be that time, it's not that he has observed things are getting worse and he knew that they were coming. It's he's surprised that they're there. And so that's an interesting dynamic too, for us to be given a character that kind of fits that, like, you know, puppet master behind the scenes archetype that you're referencing, but it does it in a way where this puppet master isn't actually pulling strings. They just happen to be where these characters need them to be.
Yeah, I think that helps me a little bit, and I would say it fits with kind of my interpretation of him. I agree that I almost would expect him to be all powerful, but I didn't read him as that. He felt more like a guardian figure, right? The man who stands at the doorway, the monster that stands at the doorway, and just make sure that everybody who gets in the room with the power is meant to get in the room. That kind of one last test. And again, not a combat test necessarily, but he's clearly like, oh, you're authorized, essentially, and sends them in. So, that makes me wonder, who is there an all-powerful, right? So we're going to the eye of the world, clearly. I think that's the name of the next chapter. Or it's in the title.
Yeah, it is.
So is there going to be somebody in there, or is there a godlike figure, an all-knowing, all-powerful being, or is there just going to be the power itself, right? And what is there for the characters to encounter, I guess, is the questions I have.
And I have absolutely no answers for you other than to say, guess what? You can read on now. We have recorded this podcast. You've got another 2 chapters lying ahead of you. And we are obviously now very close to the end of this book. We've only got 2 episodes left. And as we mentioned last time, we are going to be dropping them simultaneously. So just be aware, next week you will be getting 2 episodes that cover the last 4 chapters of the book. Read and watch at your leisure. And then we're going to be taking a little bit of a break. We are not going to be coming back until January 11th, where we will be dropping our first episode of the second book. We will be looking at both the prologue and chapter 1 of The Great Hunt on January 11th. That being said, next week we are going to be talking about chapter 50 of The Eye of the World, Meetings at the Eye, and chapter 51, Against the Shadow. So these are going to be 2 chapters that basically get us up to, and depending on who you talk to, through the climax of this book. So get excited for next time and the time after, because they'll happen simultaneously next time through the Glass Columns.
So ends another episode of Through the Glass Columns. We thank you for joining us and continuing with us on our quest to cover all of the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time.
This podcast features original content developed by Tylor Orm and Greg Cass, and is not in any way affiliated with, associated with, or condoned by the Robert Jordan Estate, Tor Fantasy, or Amazon. All content is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only.
If you're enjoying this podcast, please seek out the books from your local bookshop or library and join us as we continue our journey. If you'd like to contact us to share your thoughts or give feedback, you can email us at throughtheglasscolumns@gmail.com or find us on Instagram and Twitter by searching Through the Glass Columns.
Thank you once again for being part of this community. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe to the show, leave us a review wherever you're listening, and recommend the show on your social media to help us grow our community. We look forward to welcoming you back next time through the Glass Columns.